Yes,
Who
sir.
we got next?
We have William J. Abram, and he is outlet professor of Wesley Studies, and I'm not even going to try and pronounce that, at Altshuler. Dr. Abraham, help me out there.
It's the Altshuler.
Go one more time.
Altshuler Distinguished Teaching Professor.
Well, God bless you. He got that distinguishing comment just for being able to pronounce the word.
You want to stop now, Jim, or you want to keep going?
Done.
Okay.
That's right.
At the Perkins School of Theology, located at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas, USA. Your book is called Shaking Hands with the Devil, Dr. Abraham. Why don't you set it up for us?
Well, it's really a book about the intersection of theology and terrorism. So what happened, I was brought up in the south of the north of Ireland and really lived the early part of my life with terrorism as a background music. And I left Ireland to come over here to teach and thought I'd left all that behind. And then discovered actually, particularly after 9/11, that's just not the case. And so what I decided to do was to write a book which is really, I operate more as a layperson in all of this, but I wanted to write a book which would be informative about the connection between religion and terrorism and religion. That's the background to it.
Now, explain for our listeners maybe who don't know, in Northern Ireland, the terrorism that you're talking about. What is the conflict? What is or what was the conflict there that led to that?
That's a wonderful question. My reading of it is that in the north of Ireland you've got two kinds of nationalism operating. So you've got a group which are identified as loyalists who want to keep Northern Ireland inside the United Kingdom. And then you've got another group which are often identified as Republicans who are really Irish nationalists. And the problem we face is that you've got two groups of people with different national identity who happened historically to have different religious identities. And they are basically fighting over whether they should keep Northern Ireland in the United Kingdom or whether Northern Ireland should be joined to the south of Ireland, to ERA. And the heart of the dispute is, in my judgment, nationalist and political. It's not fundamentally religious in that respect.
Now, Ireland is its own country, separate from England.
Right, it's part of it is separated. The southern part, which includes 26 counties, with Dublin as the capital, is a fully independent country, which is a member of the European Union. But Northern Ireland which is 6 counties up in the north, with Belfast as the capital. It's actually intimately in union. It's completely in union with Scotland, Wales, England, and Northern Ireland.
Part of Great Britain.
Part of the United Kingdom.
United
Kingdom. Better way to put it.
I'm
yes.
sorry.
It's part of the United Kingdom.
Okay.
And so it's the folk up there who are loyalists and those who are unionists basically want to sustain that union. And the country divided in the early 1920s after Civil War.
Who used terrorism?
Both sides. What you've got here is that both of the nationalist groups, whether they're identified as the various operations within the IRA or offshoots of that, or groups that operate within what's called the loyalist community, both of those will use terrorism, have used terrorism ruthlessly.
How do they use terrorism? What forms of terrorism do they use?
Oh, it comes in all sorts of forms. I mean, the primary issue is to kill innocent people.
Really?
Oh, indeed. I mean, the heart of terrorism, I understand it, is to kill innocent people for political purposes.
But now, those movements, the IRA and the loyalists you call them,
UVF and whatnot, yes, UDA.
What I've seen, and you know much more about this than I do, but just the last 10, 15, 20 years, when you've had this kind of thing, it's car bombs that go off that don't, maybe they will or maybe they won't hurt innocent people, but they're meant to terrorize, not to kill and maim innocent people, but maybe, correct me, as opposed to the Islamic form of terrorism, which is intended to murder the infidel. So
no, I actually want to put it more robustly.
Okay.
Because the troubles really started in the late 60s, more recently. I mean, we've had a civil war really from 69 onwards until the peace process sort of took care of that. But I mean, you got, for example, let me give you just two examples. One is that in the area where I was brought up, completely innocent young men who were the inheritors of farms in the area would be picked off and killed when they would be out killing the cattle. And these are completely ordinary, innocent civilians.
Right.
And likewise, you had bombs, for example, which were deliberately placed at bus stations or in train stations, where utterly innocent people getting off trains would be blown to pieces.
Okay.
And so I'm not going to give a free pass on that one.
I
think this
understand.
is very
I wasn't
serious
either. I was just, I was seeing was.
stuff. I understand.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on. We're talking to Dr. William Abraham, and his book is called Shaking Hands with the Devil. Talk about now the modern day global terrorist movement, which is,
all right.
What's that connected to?
Well, this is where I think the distinction between the north of Ireland and the wider terrorist challenge comes in. When I first started to work on this, I wasn't sure, what would I find? And what I found was that within the radical form of Islam, which I've described as Islamist in the book overall, within that there's a very clear set of theological warrants and ideas that actually support the use of terrorism. That's to say, the killing of innocent people for political purposes. And that's a very hard pill for a lot of people to swallow, inside and outside the academy. It's not that all of Islam in any way is committed to this. Mainstream Islam is not. Liberal, reformed Islam is not. But if you get to forms of terrorism that are connected, say, to Al-Qaeda, they are very clearly motivated by and defended by and justified by theological convictions, which are given through divine revelation. That, it seems to me, is a very important observation to make.
All right, you're listening to the program Today's Issues. Our guest is William Abraham, and we're talking about Shaking Hands with the Devil, which is his book, and it talks about the intersection of terrorism and theology. Now, you said that for the Islamists that it's based on divine revelation. How is that different than... So I guess what I want to get to here is that the overwhelming population keeps hammering down that Islam is a religion of peace. But according to your studies, that's not the case?
I think that's a generalization that will not hold. I mean, there are extraordinarily large numbers of Muslims in Indonesia and other parts of the world who belong to what I would call the mainstream tradition and who also are reformists. They're almost like Protestants inside Islam. And they definitely want to work out particularly the latter. They want to work out a peaceful coexistence with other people. But the group that's behind the terrorist organizations, they clearly self-identify as Muslims, as Islam, as Islamists. And if you read the literature underneath what they're doing in their theological material, then it seems to me they have every right to call themselves Muslims. We don't get to decide who is or isn't a Muslim at that stage. They clearly self-identify with Islam, and further, there's a long history which they can appeal to in terms of their interpretation of divine revelation in the Islamic tradition.
What about the Quran itself, which is the holy book for Muslims? Does it, in your estimation, does it encourage violence against non-believers, against what the infidels, or is that a misreading of the Quran?
Well, I think it's ambiguous. I think the proper way to put it would be it's ambiguous, and so what happens is you can take texts and put them with other texts and run with them, and then you can get to where the radical Islamists are. Or you can take the same texts and relativize them and put them with other texts, and you're enabled, therefore, to argue that from within Islam, you're not committed to terrorism. And that, in fact, is exactly what the mainstream Muslim scholars have insisted on. And I think it's very important to take that seriously.
What about I've read some of the Quran. I've read a lot of it, but it's, boy, for an American white boy, it's hard. It's hard to follow. I mean, really is. I mean, it's, you know what I'm saying? The Bible, at least, is a sort of a history and
right.
You could a timeline and everything like that. The Quran is altogether different. But talk about slay the infidel wherever you may find him. I mean, something like that. I mean, is there context for that?
Well, and there are ways in which you can read that it has to do with the particular context, and then you simply say, look, the context has changed. And the equivalent, the equivalent on the Christian side, like, for example, on material and slavery, and they would say, look, that was the sort of seen as appropriate in the particular social context in which it was operating, but we're not committed to slavery now. So I think you've got to give some slack here to our friends and whatnot in the Islamic world. So if you take a simple, straight reading of it, you can certainly, it's horrendous. And that's precisely what I think the more radical forms, they take that simple reading and run with it.
Yeah.
And but I think it's the problem of how you appropriate it and interpret it is not going to go away. And the crucially important thing for the future is that it's very important that there be Muslims who, in fact, counter that interpretation and provide a way whereby they can find a place within Western democracies and within the Western world.
So in your book, Shaking Hands with the Devil, who is the devil?
Yeah, that's a very good question. What I really mean by that, it's not that I don't believe in the devil. In fact, I'm a thoroughgoing, unapologetic supernaturalist, and I think actually that things like exorcism are very important and very real. But I'm using it in a softer sense, in that there's forms of human evil which are what I'm going to call diabolical. And that's where you take something like, you say you're committed to human welfare, you're committed to liberating people, you're committed to justice, and you're committed to peace. But when you actually look at what they do with that, they turn it upside down, and they use it to actually destroy people and kill people and murder people. And you can see this in the Irish situation. I remember seeing a poster in my hometown which was committed to what was called inclusive peace. Well, I knew the people who were behind this, and they took this language and used it to justify killing innocent people. So what I mean, when I speak of shaking hands with the devil here, A, I mean that there's a diabolical dimension to the human evil that goes on here, and B, what I'm after is, this is really serious stuff. To deal with the evil that you face here is going to be a very, very serious challenge. And it's going to be a very serious political challenge and a very serious religious and theological challenge.
We're talking to Dr. William Abraham. He's a professor at Southern Methodist University in Dallas. A related question to the terrorism that you've described, based in Islamism, or a radical view of Islam, as you would describe it. How do you explain the mindset of the what is commonly called the politically correct people in the media and in politics, in particular in America and maybe in the West, who will not acknowledge that what you've been talking about even exists hardly? You see what happened with the Fort Hood case.
Yes.
Where the Defense Department, the Pentagon, under the Obama administration, they won't even bring up the idea of jihad or terrorism. They call it workplace violence. There's hardly any acknowledgement that the Boston bombers were motivated by jihad, even though they said that they were. I mean, why do you think that our leaders go bend over backwards to deny reality?
I think this is a very good question. There's two levels in which I'll quickly answer it. One is a benign explanation, is that they basically are worried that if they don't take a soft line, given the intimidation and given the abuse of what they say will lead to more terrorism and more violence. But I think the deeper question here, and I deal with it in two chapters of the book, actually, in Chapter 4 and Chapter 7, the deeper question here is ignorance. Our culture, and I speak here within American culture, while we have a lot of religion and a lot of theology, among a lot of the ruling elite and among a lot of lay people in our churches, they simply are illiterate when it comes to the history of these issues. And particularly secularists and hardline secularists, they bought a position really in the 1960s that religion was going to die out. And so they stopped paying any attention to this. And the result is that when this shows up, the categories they've got are hopelessly inadequate. They simply are blind. They're simply tone deaf to what's really going on. And one of the reasons I wrote the book was precisely to bring out that you can't understand this without understanding